He is wearing a dead man's hat. Not literally dead, not yet. But Captain C.J. Relea has no idea what is happening to his ship right now. And by the time he finds out, Robert Smalls will either be free or he will be hanging from a rope in Charleston Harbor. There is no third option. There never was. It is 3 a.m., May 13th, 1862. The water is black, the air is thick with the smell of salt water and coal smoke, and a 23-year-old enslaved man is standing at the helm of a Confederate military warship, easing her engines to life in the darkness, praying that the sound of the boiler doesn't wake the wrong person on the wrong dock at the wrong moment. He has stolen this ship, right now, tonight, in the middle of the most heavily fortified Confederate harbor in the American South, and he is heading straight toward 5 armed checkpoints. 5 moments where a single wrong signal, one misremembered whistle sequence, one guard who looks too closely at the silhouette at the helm, ends this, ends him, ends his children who are huddled below decks right now, breathing as quietly as children can breathe when their mother has told them, in a voice that allows no argument, that their lives depend on the next hour of silence. Robert Smalls does not flinch. He adjusts the captain's hat low over his brow. He knows this harbor the way he knows his own heartbeat. Every current, every sandbank, every checkpoint guard's rhythm and routine. He has been studying this moment for months, planning it, rehearsing it in his mind in the darkness of every night he has spent enslaved on this vessel.
Fort Johnson is ahead, the first checkpoint, the first test. He reaches for the signal cord, gives the correct whistle sequence, the one he memorized by watching, by listening, by being the kind of man that everyone around him chronically, catastrophically underestimated. A pause. The harbor breathes. Fort Johnson waves them through. 4 checkpoints to go, and somewhere out in the gray pre-dawn darkness, beyond the last Confederate picket line, the Union blockade fleet is sitting at anchor, completely unaware that the most important intelligence coup of the entire Civil War is sailing toward them at full steam, if they don't shoot it out of the water first. To understand the full weight of what Robert Smalls did on that harbor in the pre-dawn darkness, you have to understand what the world had spent 23 years telling him he was. Not a man, not a pilot, not a strategist, not a hero. Property. He was born in 1839 in Beaufort, South Carolina, into a world that had constructed an entire legal, economic, and social architecture around a single monstrous premise, that certain human beings were objects, that they could be bought, sold, worked to death, separated from their children, and bred like livestock, and that this was not only legal, but ordained, natural, correct. Robert Smalls was born into that world as its prisoner. But he was also born with something his enslavers never accounted for, a mind that never stopped moving, eyes that never stopped watching, and a mother who understood with terrifying clarity exactly what her son was up against. Lydia Smalls made a decision early in Robert's life that reads almost like a military briefing. She was enslaved by a man named John McKee in Beaufort, but Robert, lighter-skinned, more ambiguously positioned in the brutal racial hierarchy of the antebellum South, had been somewhat sheltered from the worst of what slavery looked like. Lydia ended that, deliberately. She asked McKee to let Robert see it all, the whippings, the chain gangs, the auctions where families were separated with the casual efficiency of livestock sorting. She wanted her son to feel the full suffocating reality of the cage he was living in. She wanted him to understand exactly what he was fighting. She wanted him dangerous. It worked. As a teenager, Robert was hired out to Charleston, a city that crackled with commerce and contradiction, a place where enslaved men worked the docks alongside free men, and the lines between worlds blurred just enough to be instructive. Robert absorbed Charleston like a sponge absorbs water. He worked the waterfront, he learned the harbor, he developed an almost supernatural feel for the tidal rhythms, the channel depths, the sandbar locations that could ground a careless pilot in the dark. He became, by any honest professional assessment, one of the finest watermen in Charleston. And nobody who owned him noticed, because they weren't looking, because the architecture of slavery required its enforcers to maintain a particular kind of willful blindness, a refusal to see competence, intelligence, or humanity in the people they oppressed, because seeing it would require them to confront what they were doing. That blindness was Robert Small's greatest weapon. By the time the Civil War erupted in April 1861 and the CSS Planter, a 150-foot side-wheel steamer, was pressed into Confederate military service as a transport and dispatch vessel, Robert Smalls was assigned to her crew. He was listed as a deckhand. In practice, he was the man who piloted the ship. He knew her engines, her draft, her turning radius in tight harbor conditions. He knew her better than the white officers who drew the salary and wore the uniform. He also knew their habits, their schedules, their complacency. Captain Relea and his officers had a routine of leaving the ship in the evenings to sleep ashore. It was a serious breach of military protocol. It was also, from Robert Small's perspective, an appointment, a standing invitation. For months he watched, for months he planned. He memorized the signal codes, the specific whistle sequences required at each Confederate checkpoint in the harbor. He studied the visual recognition protocols. He noted the timing of the guard rotations. He recruited his crew, the other enslaved men aboard the Planter, one quiet conversation at a time, reading each man carefully before trusting him with a secret that could get them all killed. Every single man said yes. And then he went home and told his wife. Hannah Small's response to her husband's plan, a plan that involved stealing a Confederate warship, navigating 5 armed Confederate checkpoints in the dark, and sailing into a Union naval blockade, has not been recorded in detail by history. What has been recorded is that she agreed to bring her children and meet him at a prearranged point in the harbor in the darkness, which tells you everything you need to know about Hannah Smalls. She had done her own calculation. She had weighed the odds, and she had decided that the life waiting for her children in slavery was a worse risk than the one her husband was proposing. They were going, all of them, together, or not at all. But what Robert Smalls couldn't control, what no amount of planning could fully account for, was what waited on the other side of those Confederate checkpoints, because getting past the Confederate guns was half the problem. The other half was the Union Navy, and the Union Navy had orders to fire on anything that moved in Charleston Harbor without authorization. Robert Smalls was sailing his family out of slavery and directly into a wall of Union cannons, and nobody on those Union ships was expecting him. The Planter's engines breathed to life at 3 a.m. with a sound that felt, in the silence of the harbor, like a shout. Robert Smalls stood at the helm and held himself completely still. Every instinct he had was calibrated to this moment. He had run these engines hundreds of times. He knew exactly how loud they were, exactly how that sound carried across water in the dark, exactly how long it would take for a man on the dock to hear it, register it, and decide it was worth investigating. He counted the seconds. Nobody came. He eased the Planter away from the southern wharf and into the black water of Charleston Harbor. The city lights were behind him now. Ahead, the harbor opened up into darkness, and somewhere in that darkness, 5 Confederate checkpoints stood between him and everything he was reaching for. First stop was not a checkpoint, it was the North Atlantic Wharf. Hannah was there. She was waiting in the darkness with their 3 children, their daughter Elizabeth, their son Robert Jr., and their infant, along with 12 other enslaved people who had decided that tonight was the night. Loading them onto the Planter in the middle of Confederate Charleston, engines running, coal smoke rising, was the most exposed moment of the entire operation. Every second they spent at that wharf was a second in which a single insomniac Confederate soldier, a single dock worker starting an early shift, a single officer who had forgotten something on the ship could have ended everything. It took longer than it should have. One of the women froze with fear. Children had to be passed up over the railing in the dark. Every sound was enormous. Every splash was a gunshot. And then they were aboard, and Robert Smalls pointed the Planter's bow toward Fort Johnson and pushed the engines to her normal running speed. Not fast, that would draw attention. Not slow, that would draw attention. Exactly the speed of a ship on an authorized early morning run, driven by a man who had made this trip dozens of times and had nothing to hide. He reached for the signal cord and gave the Fort Johnson whistle, the correct sequence, 3 long, 1 short. The harbor held its breath. Fort Johnson responded, cleared them through. The Planter moved on. Robert Smalls did not exhale. He could not afford to exhale. Fort Sumter was ahead, the most famous fortification in the Confederacy, the place where the entire war had begun 14 months earlier, its walls still scarred from the Union bombardment that had failed to take it. Its guns could sink the Planter in seconds. Its guards were presumably more alert than those at the outer checkpoints, more experienced, more suspicious of anomalies. Robert Smalls brought the Planter up to Fort Sumter at exactly the right speed, on exactly the right heading, and gave the correct recognition signal, including, by multiple historical accounts, the additional visual signal of the Planter's distinctive flag, which he flew exactly as it should have been flown on any authorized Confederate run. He stood at the wheel in the captain's silhouette, hat low, shoulders squared, every muscle in his body made of iron. Fort Sumter cleared them through. He was past the last major Confederate fortification. Ahead, the harbor opened toward the sea. The Confederate picket line was the last obstacle, a relatively lightly armed outer checkpoint, and beyond it, in the gray pre-dawn light that was just beginning to soften the eastern horizon, the shapes of Union blockade ships were emerging from the darkness. The picket line, the signal, the clearance. And then Robert Smalls did something that no amount of planning had fully prepared him for. He ordered the Confederate colors hauled down, and in their place, in a detail so perfect it feels scripted but wasn't, a white bedsheet was raised, a flag of surrender, a flag of peace, a flag that said, "We are not your enemy." He pushed the Planter's engines to full speed and drove her straight at the Union fleet. What happened next almost killed every single person aboard. The USS Onward was the Union vessel closest to the Planter's approach, and her crew did exactly what a warship crew was trained to do when an unidentified Confederate vessel came charging at them out of Charleston Harbor at full speed in the pre-dawn darkness. They ran to their guns. The Onward's crew had no idea what they were looking at. From their perspective, a Confederate military steamer, flying a white flag, yes, but white flags had been used as ruses before, was bearing down on them at full speed from the most heavily fortified Confederate harbor on the Atlantic coast. The guns were loaded. The order to fire was forming in the officer's throat. And then someone on the Onward saw the white sheet more clearly. And then someone else saw the people on the deck, not Confederate soldiers at battle stations, but men and women and children, waving their arms, waving anything they had, making themselves as visible and as human and as unthreatening as it was possible to be at full steam in a stolen warship at 4 a.m. The order to fire was swallowed. The Onward's captain, Lieutenant J.F. Nichols, brought his ship alongside the Planter, And Robert Smalls, 23 years old, still wearing the Confederate captain's hat, his wife and children behind him, 12 other formerly enslaved people on his decks, Confederate cannons in his hold, and Confederate code books under his arm, looked up at the Union officer and delivered what may be the single greatest line in the history of the American Civil War. "Good morning, sir. I have brought you some of the Confederacy's finest." What he had brought them was almost incomprehensible in its strategic value. The Planter herself was worth a fortune, a working military vessel immediately pressed into Union service. The cannons were valuable, the ammunition was valuable, but the code books, the signal books, the charts showing the precise location of every Confederate torpedo, every mine laid in Charleston Harbor, that intelligence was priceless. It would directly enable future Union naval operations in the region. It gave the Union Navy a map of the invisible death that the Confederates had seeded in those waters. It potentially saved hundreds of Union sailors' lives in the operations that followed. And it had been delivered by a man who was, under the laws of the United States of America at that moment, still legally a piece of property. The Union officers were stunned. The story raced up the chain of command with the speed of a telegraph wire on fire. Within days, it was in the newspapers. Within weeks, it was on the floor of the United States Congress. And what Congress did with it, what the story of Robert Smalls forced the United States government to confront, cracked open a debate that would change the composition of the Union Army forever. But here is where the story takes a turn that history books consistently fail to follow. Because what the United States government gave Robert Smalls in return for what he had handed them, what they decided his audacity, his intelligence, his sacrifice was actually worth, is where the real controversy begins.
Congress passed the Prize Act. Under its provisions, the crew of a captured enemy vessel was entitled to a share of the prize money, the assessed value of the ship and its cargo. The Planter was assessed. The cannons were assessed. The ammunition was assessed. Robert Smalls and his crew received their share. It came to approximately $1,500 split among the crew. Robert Smalls' individual portion was something in the range of a few $100s for a vessel and intelligence package that military historians have assessed as one of the most significant coups of the entire war. A few $100s for the code books that mapped every mine in Charleston Harbor, for the cannons, for the ship, for the intelligence that saved lives and altered naval strategy, for the most daring act of resistance and courage that the harbor had ever seen. But the money, insultingly small as it was, wasn't even the most revealing part of the government's response. The most revealing part was the argument that erupted in Washington in the weeks and months after Robert Smalls sailed the Planter to freedom, because what his act had demonstrated, undeniably, irrefutably, in front of the entire nation, was that enslaved black men were not only willing to fight for the Union, they were capable of extraordinary strategic thinking, courage under pressure, and military initiative that put most of the Union's own officers to shame. This was dangerous knowledge, not dangerous to the Confederacy, dangerous to the comfortable assumptions of a Union that had spent the first year of the war refusing to let black men serve as soldiers, refusing. The official policy of the Lincoln administration in 1861 and into 1862 was that this was a war to preserve the Union, not a war about slavery, and that arming black men was a political bridge too far. Robert Smalls blew that argument out of the water, literally. His action was one of a constellation of pressures that pushed the Lincoln administration toward the decision it had been avoiding. The intelligence value of formerly enslaved people, people who knew Confederate fortifications, supply lines, signal codes, and military dispositions from the inside had been demonstrated beyond any reasonable denial. The courage and capability of black men in military contexts had been demonstrated beyond any reasonable denial.
Less than 8 months after Robert Smalls sailed the Planter to freedom, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, and crucially, it authorized the enlistment of black soldiers into the Union Army. Robert Smalls himself became a recruiter. He traveled, he spoke, he was living proof of what black men could do when given half a chance and a stolen warship. He helped raise black regiments that would go on to fight with devastating effectiveness in the war's final years. And then the war ended, and America decided what to do with men like Robert Smalls.
What happened to Robert Smalls after the Civil War is a story that is simultaneously extraordinary and enraging in equal measure. And it tells you more about what America actually valued than any monument or textbook ever could. He went back to Beaufort, South Carolina. He went back to the town where he had been born into slavery. And he bought the house. Not just any house, the house of the man who had enslaved him. The Henry McKee House on Prince Street in Beaufort, where Robert Smalls had spent his childhood as property, he now owned as a free man and an American citizen. That alone is a story of almost novelistic justice, but it's what he did next that reveals the full dimensions of who Robert Smalls was. When his former enslaver's widow, an elderly woman named Jane McKee, fell into poverty and had nowhere to go, Robert Smalls let her live in the house he had bought, the house where she had once been his mistress. He took care of her. Some accounts suggest he was motivated by genuine compassion. Others suggest he remembered that Jane McKee had been kind to him as a child. Whatever the reason, the image of it, the formerly enslaved man providing shelter to the widow of the man who owned him, is almost too large to fit inside the normal categories of human behavior. He didn't stop there. Robert Smalls entered politics. In the extraordinary period of Reconstruction, when black men in the South briefly held real political power, backed by federal enforcement, he rose rapidly. He served in the South Carolina State Legislature. He served in the United States House of Representatives 5 terms. He fought for public education, for civil rights, for the infrastructure of a rebuilt South that actually included all of its citizens. He was, by any measure, one of the most remarkable Americans of the 19th century. And then Reconstruction ended. Federal troops withdrew from the South. The white supremacist governments of the Redeemer Democrats swept back into power across the former Confederacy with a campaign of violence and voter suppression that was systematic, brutal, and largely ignored by a Northern public that had decided it was tired of the whole business of racial justice. He was gerrymandered out of his congressional seat. He was physically threatened. The political world he had helped build was dismantled around him. He died in 1915 in Beaufort, South Carolina, in the house he had bought from slavery, surrounded by a community that revered him, known to almost nobody outside that community. The man who had handed the Union Navy one of its greatest intelligence coups of the Civil War, the man whose act of courage had helped force the arming of black soldiers, the man who had served 5 terms in the United States Congress, the man who had shown more strategic brilliance in a single night than most generals showed in an entire war. Forgotten, buried, erased. Not by accident, by design. Because the story of Robert Smalls, a story of black genius, black courage, black political power, and black dignity, did not fit the story that post-Reconstruction America was telling itself, the story of the lost cause. The story of noble Confederate sacrifice and the inevitable natural order of white supremacy. That story required Robert Smalls to disappear. And so he did. From the textbooks, from the monuments, from the national memory. For 100 years.
Here is what the erasure of Robert Smalls actually cost us. Not as a matter of historical accounting, but as a matter of what a nation becomes when it decides which stories are worth telling. When you erase Robert Smalls, you erase the evidence that the Civil War was won not just by white generals and white soldiers, but by the intelligence, the courage, and the sacrifice of the very people the war was ostensibly being fought over. You erase the fact that formerly enslaved people were providing military intelligence to the Union from the very first months of the war, intelligence that was often more accurate and more operationally valuable than anything the official military apparatus was generating. You erase the argument that Black Americans were not passive recipients of freedom, but active architects of it. You also erase the argument that would have been most devastating to the lost cause mythology, the argument that the Confederacy was not defeated by overwhelming Northern industrial might alone, but was undermined from within by the very people it had enslaved, that the 4 million enslaved people of the American South were not just the cause of the war, but one of the decisive factors in its outcome. That is a story with consequences that reach far beyond the 1860s. It reaches into every subsequent argument about Black capability, Black citizenship, Black political participation. Every time that argument was made, every time someone in the decades after the war claimed that Black Americans were not fit for self-governance, not capable of military service, not deserving of full citizenship, the honest answer was Robert Smalls. The honest answer was, we already ran this experiment, and you are lying about the results. But the results had been buried. The experiment had been erased. And here is the final, most devastating irony of all. The house on Prince Street in Beaufort, where Robert Smalls was born into slavery, where he raised his family in freedom, where he died in 1915, it still stands. It is a national historic landmark now. There is a statue of him in Beaufort. There are schools named after him. But ask 100 Americans who Robert Smalls was. Ask them on the street, in a classroom, at a dinner table. The number who can answer you will tell you exactly how well the erasure worked and exactly how much work there is still to do. Robert Smalls stole a Confederate warship at 23 years old with nothing but his nerve, his knowledge, and a dead man's hat. He handed the Union Navy intelligence that changed the course of the war. He recruited Black soldiers who helped win it. He served his country in Congress for 5 terms. He sheltered the widow of the man who had enslaved him. He was, by any honest measure, one of the greatest Americans who ever lived, and most of America still doesn't know his name. That is not an accident. That is a choice. And the question this video wants to leave you with